The sound of metal striking metal echoed through the early morning mist, each blow precise and thunderous, reverberating off the weathered walls of Millbrook Valley's old lumber mill. Most folks crossed the street when they heard that sound, knowing it meant Marcus Stone was already at work before dawn broke across the mountains. They called him the Beast, though none dared say it to his scarred face. What they didn't know was that inside that mill, something beautiful was happening. A woman who had never held a pencil was learning to write her own name, one careful letter at a time, guided by hands that the town believed were only capable of destruction. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The winter of 1894 arrived in Millbrook Valley like an unwelcome guest, settling in early and refusing to leave. Snow piled against the wooden storefronts along Main Street, and the bitter wind carried the constant smell of wood smoke and the sharp tang of metal from the mill. It was the kind of cold that made people hurry past each other without meeting eyes, heads down, focused only on reaching the warmth of their destinations. Elena Rivera clutched her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders as she made her way down the icy boardwalk, her worn boots sliding slightly on the frost-covered planks. 3 months she had been in this town. 3 months since she had stepped off the train with nothing but a battered suitcase and a heart full of desperate hope. The money her brother had sent from California was supposed to last until she could find steady work, but winter had come early, and jobs for a woman who spoke broken English were scarcer than spring flowers in a blizzard. She paused outside Harper's General Store, pressing her palm against the frosted window to peer inside. Samuel Harper was arranging bolts of fabric on the counter, his gentle movements deliberate and patient. He had been kind to her, kinder than most, never raising his voice when she struggled to understand his words, never making her feel small when she couldn't find the English she needed. But even his kindness had limits, and she knew he couldn't afford to keep giving her credit much longer. The sound that made everyone else hurry past drew Elena's attention like a magnet. The rhythmic hammering from the mill carried a strange comfort, a steadiness that reminded her of her father's workshop back home, before the sickness took him, before everything fell apart. She found herself walking toward the sound instead of away from it, her curiosity stronger than the fear the townspeople had tried to plant in her heart with their whispered warnings about Marcus Stone. The mill stood at the edge of town, a massive wooden structure that had once processed timber for the growing settlement. Now it served as both lumber yard and smithy, the great forge inside throwing dancing shadows against the walls. The wide doors stood open despite the cold, and Elena could see the silhouette of a man moving within, his movements powerful and controlled as he worked the glowing metal. She had seen him before, of course. In a town the size of Millbrook Valley, everyone saw everyone eventually. Marcus Stone was impossible to miss, standing a head taller than most men, his shoulders broad enough to fill doorways. The left side of his face bore the twisted scars of old burns, the skin pulled tight and pale against his weathered features. His dark hair hung long and unkempt, and he kept his eyes down when he walked through town, speaking to no one, acknowledged by no one. The stories about him changed depending on who was telling them. Some said he had killed a man in a bar fight back east and fled to the frontier to escape justice. Others whispered that he had been in a prison fire, that the scars were punishment for unspeakable crimes. The children, emboldened by distance and adult fears, dared each other to run past the mill, calling him beast and monster before scampering away, shrieking with terrified laughter. Elena had never participated in such cruelty. She understood too well what it meant to be marked as different, to be judged by appearance and accent rather than character. But she had also never approached the mill, never lingered to watch the man work. Today, something in the rhythm of his hammer, Something in the loneliness of the sound made her feet slow to a stop. Through the open doors, she could see Marcus, working over the forge, his massive frame bent in concentration over a piece of red-hot iron. The fire cast strange shadows on the scarred side of his face, but Elena found herself focusing instead on his hands. They moved with surprising delicacy for their size, shaping the metal with an artist's precision. Sparks flew with each strike, creating brief constellations in the dim interior of the mill, and Elena realized she was holding her breath. A sharp voice cut through the morning air like a blade through silk. "Elena Rivera, what on earth are you doing standing there like a fool?" Elena spun around to find Victoria Ashford approaching, her burgundy wool coat pristine despite the mud and slush that covered the streets. Victoria's blonde hair was perfectly arranged beneath a fashionable hat, and her blue eyes held the cold judgment that Elena had come to expect from the women of Millbrook Valley's more established families. Behind Victoria walked Thomas Whitman, his expensive boots clicking against the wooden boardwalk as he hurried to catch up. "Miss Ashford," Elena managed, her English careful and measured. You were just gawking at that monster." "Like some kind of simpleton," Victoria interrupted, her voice pitched loud enough to carry. "Really, Elena, I know you're new here, but surely even someone from your background understands the danger of encouraging such a creature." The hammering inside the mill stopped abruptly. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, partly from embarrassment, and partly from anger. She understood more English than she let on, and she caught the deliberate emphasis Victoria placed on your background, the way it made her origin sound like something shameful. Thomas Whitman stepped forward, his hand resting possessively on Victoria's elbow. He was a handsome man in the way that money often made men handsome, well-fed and well-dressed, with the confidence that came from never having to question his place in the world. "Miss Rivera," he said, his tone condescending, "perhaps you don't understand how things work here. That man is dangerous. He's not someone a decent woman should associate with." Elena's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I understand more than you think," she said, her accent thickening with emotion. "I understand that judging by appearance is a cruel thing." Victoria's laugh was like breaking glass. "Oh, my dear, it's not about appearance. Well, not entirely. That man has done things, terrible things. Why do you think he hides away in that mill like some wounded animal? Why do you think no decent person in this town will have anything to do with him?" "What things?" Elena asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "What has he done?" Thomas and Victoria exchanged a look, the kind of look that passed between people who shared secrets and social position. "There was a fire," Thomas said finally, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Back in Denver, a warehouse fire that killed 3 men. Marcus Stone was the only one who survived. Some say he started it," Victoria added, her eyes glittering with malicious satisfaction. "Others say he could have saved those men but chose not to. Either way, he's marked, Elena, marked by God and marked by his own guilty conscience. That's why he came here, to hide among decent people who want nothing to do with his kind." Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach, but it wasn't fear of Marcus Stone. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was fear of the casual cruelty she heard in Victoria's voice, the way she seemed to take pleasure in spreading poison about a man who couldn't defend himself. "You were there?" Elena asked quietly. "You saw this fire?" "Of course not," Victoria snapped. "But everyone knows. Everyone knows stories," Elena interrupted, her voice stronger now. "Stories change, truth does not." The silence that followed was sharp and dangerous. Victoria's face flushed with anger, and Thomas's jaw tightened. Elena realized she had crossed some invisible line, challenged the social order that kept people like Victoria at the top and people like herself grateful for scraps of acceptance. "I see," Victoria said, her voice silk wrapped around steel. "How foolish of me to think someone of your education would understand the complexities of civilized society. Perhaps you and the beast deserve each other after all." She turned on her heel and stalked away, Thomas following like an obedient shadow. Elena watched them go, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had made an enemy today, she knew that much, in a town where she was already struggling to find her place. She had chosen to defend a man she didn't even know against people whose approval could mean the difference between survival and starvation. The sound of footsteps on gravel made her turn. Marcus Stone stood in the doorway of the mill, his massive frame filling the opening. Up close, Elena could see that his eyes were a deep brown, almost black, and they held an intelligence that the stories about him never mentioned. His scarred face was impassive, but Elena caught something in his expression that made her think he had heard every word of the conversation. They stood looking at each other for a long moment, the morning mist swirling between them like something from a dream. Elena wondered what he saw when he looked at her, whether he recognized a fellow outcast or simply another townsperson who would eventually turn away in fear or disgust. Finally Marcus spoke, his voice surprisingly gentle for such a large man. "You shouldn't have done that," he said. "Victoria Ashford has a long memory and a longer reach in this town." Elena lifted her chin, surprised by her own stubbornness. She was saying cruel things. Someone needed to speak against them. Marcus studied her for another moment, then stepped back into the mill. "Cruelty is easier than kindness," he said over his shoulder. "And people like comfortable lies more than difficult truths." Elena found herself following him into the mill, drawn by something she couldn't name. The interior was larger than it had appeared from outside, with high ceilings that disappeared into shadows and workbenches covered with tools she couldn't identify. The forge dominated one wall, its fire casting dancing light across everything, and the air smelled of hot metal and wood shavings. "You don't have to be afraid," Marcus said without turning around. "I won't hurt you." "I know," Elena said, and realized she meant it. There was something about the careful way he moved, the gentleness in his voice, that spoke louder than all the stories the town told about him. Marcus glanced back at her, surprise flickering across his features. "Most people cross the street when they see me coming." "Most people are fools," Elena said, then covered her mouth in shock at her own boldness. For the first time since she had arrived in Millbrook Valley, Elena heard genuine laughter. It came from Marcus, a rich, warm sound that seemed to fill the empty spaces of the mill. "You're probably right about that," he said, turning to face her fully. "But you still shouldn't be here. Whatever you think of Victoria Ashford, she's right about one thing. Being seen with me won't do you any favors in this town." Elena looked around the mill, taking in the carefully organized tools, the projects in various stages of completion, the obvious skill and care that went into everything Marcus created. "Maybe I do not care about favors," she said. Marcus studied her with those dark eyes, and Elena felt as if he was seeing something in her that others missed. "What's your name?" he asked finally. "Elena Rivera. I'm Marcus Stone." He wiped his hands on a leather apron and extended one toward her. Elena hesitated for only a moment before taking it. His hand was warm and calloused, the grip firm but gentle. "Why do they call you Beast?" she asked, then immediately regretted the question. "I am sorry, I should not, because I look like one," Marcus said simply. "And because people need their monsters. Makes them feel safer, having someone to fear and blame for all the darkness in the world." Elena looked at his scarred face, at the way the old burns had twisted the skin, and felt something shift inside her chest. "You do not look like Beast to me," she said quietly. Marcus stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he cleared his throat and turned back to his work. "You should go," he said, but there was no harshness in his voice. before someone sees you here and starts talking." Elena nodded, knowing he was right. But as she turned to leave, something made her pause. "Mr. Stone," she said, "if you ever need help with anything, small things, I am good with my hands. I can sew, clean, organize." Marcus looked up from the piece of metal he was shaping. "Why would you want to help me?" Elena thought about all the reasons she couldn't give him, about the loneliness she saw in his eyes that matched her own, about the way he had defended her right to think for herself without even knowing her. "Because kindness is not easier than cruelty," she said finally. "But it is better." As she walked away from the mill, Elena felt the weight of eyes upon her. She knew that before the day was over, half the town would know that she had spoken with Marcus Stone. She knew that Victoria Ashford would make sure the other half heard an embellished version that would make Elena sound foolish at best, dangerous at worst. But for the first time since arriving in Millbrook Valley, Elena felt like she had done something that mattered. She had looked past the surface of things, past the stories and the scars, and seen something real. Whether that would prove to be wisdom or foolishness, only time would tell. The snow continued to fall as she made her way back toward town, each flake adding to the white blanket that covered Millbrook Valley. Behind her, the sound of hammering resumed, steady and sure, a rhythm that seemed to promise that some things, at least, could be shaped into something beautiful with enough patience and care. The next 3 days passed like a fever dream for Elena. Word of her encounter with Marcus Stone had spread through Millbrook Valley faster than wildfire in dry timber, growing more dramatic with each telling. By Tuesday morning, she was no longer just the immigrant woman who had defended the beast. She was the foolish girl who had entered his lair, the foreign troublemaker who couldn't understand proper American values, the dangerous influence who might corrupt other decent women with her reckless behavior. Mrs. Catherine Mills, the boarding house owner who had grudgingly provided Elena with a small room in exchange for daily cleaning duties, cornered her in the kitchen as she prepared breakfast for the other tenants. The older woman's face was etched with worry lines that seemed deeper than usual, and her hands twisted nervously in her apron as she spoke. "Elena, child, I need to speak with you about what happened at the mill," Mrs. Mills began, her voice carrying the weight of someone delivering unwelcome news. "I've been getting visits from some of the more prominent ladies in town, and they're expressing concerns about your judgment." Elena continued kneading the bread dough with perhaps more force than necessary, her knuckles white against the pail. "Flour. What kind of concerns, Mrs. Mills?" "They're saying you deliberately sought out Marcus Stone, that you might be planning to encourage his attention." Mrs. Mills lowered her voice to a whisper, as if speaking of something scandalous. "Victoria Ashford came by yesterday evening with her mother, and they suggested that perhaps a young woman of your background might not understand the delicate nature of proper social boundaries." The words hit Elena like physical blows, each one calculated to remind her of her place as an outsider. She had learned to recognize the particular cruelty that came wrapped in concern, the way people could destroy reputations while claiming to protect community values. "And what do you think, Mrs. Mills?" Elena asked quietly. The older woman was silent for a long moment, studying Elena's face as if searching for answers to questions she hadn't yet asked. Mrs. Mills had lost her husband in a mining accident 3 years earlier, and the boarding house was her only means of survival. Elena understood that the woman couldn't afford to alienate the town's influential families, no matter what her personal feelings might be. "I think," Mrs. Mills said carefully, "that you're a good girl who works hard and causes no trouble in my house, but I also think that perception can be more powerful than truth in a place like this. People here have long memories, Elena, and they don't easily forgive those who challenge their comfortable assumptions." Elena shaped the dough into loaves with steady hands, though her heart was racing. "Are you asking me to leave, Mrs. Mills?" "No, child, but I am asking you to be careful, very careful. The winter is long, and work is scarce for women without family connections. You can't afford to make enemies of people who might offer you employment come spring." The conversation ended there, but its implications followed Elena throughout the day like shadows. As she walked to Harper's General Store to purchase thread for her sewing work, she noticed how conversation stopped when she approached, how eyes followed her movements with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. The friendly nods she had begun to receive from some townspeople had vanished, replaced by careful distance or outright avoidance. Samuel Harper greeted her with his usual kindness, but even he seemed subdued as he wrapped her purchases. "Elena," he said quietly as he handed her the small package, "I hope you know that not everyone in this town judges a person by the company they're rumored to keep." The word rumored struck Elena as significant. In just 3 days, her brief conversation with Marcus Stone had been transformed into something much more substantial in the collective imagination of Millbrook Valley. She wondered what stories were being told, what motivations were being attributed to her actions, what future scandals were being predicted. That evening, as Elena sat in her small room mending a torn dress by candlelight, she heard voices in the hallway outside her door. Mrs. Mills was speaking with someone, their conversation conducted in the kind of hushed tones that indicated serious business. Elena found herself straining to hear, though she told herself it was none of her concern. "She's been nothing but respectful and hardworking," Mrs. Mills was saying, her voice carrying a defensive edge that Elena had never heard before. "I'm sure she has been," came the reply, and Elena recognized the smooth tones of Thomas Whitman. "But you must understand, Mrs. Mills, that her recent behavior raises questions about her judgment, questions that could reflect poorly on your establishment." Elena's hands stilled on the fabric as the full implications of Thomas's presence sank in. He wasn't just making idle conversation. He was delivering a warning, perhaps even an ultimatum. The boarding house depended on the goodwill of the community's more prosperous families, and Thomas Whitman represented exactly the kind of influence that could destroy Mrs. Mills's livelihood, if he chose to do so. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "Mr. Whitman?" Mrs. Mills asked, though her voice had lost some of its earlier strength. "I'm suggesting that a woman who deliberately associates with dangerous men might not be the sort of person you want influencing the moral atmosphere of your boarding house. Other tenants might become uncomfortable. Families might hesitate to recommend your establishment to travelers or new residents." The threat was delivered with such polite precision that it took Elena a moment to fully grasp its meaning. Thomas wasn't just trying to isolate her from the community. He was trying to destroy her ability to survive in Millbrook Valley entirely. Without the boarding house, she would have nowhere to live. Without Mrs. Mills's recommendation, she would find it nearly impossible to secure other employment or housing. "I'll speak with her," Mrs. Mills said finally, her voice barely audible through the door. "I'm sure you will," Thomas replied, and Elena could hear the satisfaction in his tone. "For everyone's sake, I hope she proves amenable to reason." After the footsteps faded down the hallway, Elena sat in the flickering candlelight and tried to steady her breathing. She understood now that her defense of Marcus Stone had been interpreted as something far more significant than a simple act of fairness. In the minds of people like Victoria Ashford and Thomas Whitman, she had chosen sides in a battle she hadn't even known was being fought. The next morning brought fresh snow and a knock on Elena's door that came earlier than usual. Mrs. Mills stood in the hallway, her face pale and drawn, holding a cup of coffee that steamed in the cold air. "Elena, dear, we need to talk," she said, and Elena knew that the conversation with Thomas Whitman had achieved its intended effect. They sat together in the small parlor that served as Mrs. Mills's private sitting room, surrounded by the carefully maintained furniture and lace doilies that spoke of better times and lost prosperity. Elena waited for the older woman to speak, understanding that this moment would likely determine her immediate future. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. Mrs. Mills began, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup as if seeking warmth, about perception and truth, and the difficulties of life in a small town. Elena nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The thing is, child, I've lived in Millbrook Valley for 27 years. I've seen how stories grow and change, how rumor can become accepted fact if repeated often enough. I've also seen how good people can be destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. Mrs. Mills set down her coffee cup and looked directly at Elena. Marcus Stone came to this town 5 years ago, after that fire in Denver. He bought the old mill with cash money, never asked for credit or favors from anyone. He's never caused trouble, never bothered decent folks, never done anything but work hard and keep to himself. Elena felt her breath catch. This was not the conversation she had expected. But people need their monsters, Elena. They need someone to blame for all the fears and uncertainties that come with frontier life. Marcus Stone, with his scars and his silence, became that monster for Millbrook Valley. And now, by associating with him, you've become part of the story. What story? Elena asked quietly. The story of the beast and the foreign girl who doesn't know her place. The story of dangerous outsiders who threaten the moral order of decent society. Mrs. Mills's voice carried a bitterness that spoke of her own experiences with small-town judgment. They're already saying you've been visiting him regularly, that you're planning some kind of inappropriate relationship. By next week, they'll probably be claiming you're living in sin. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, partly from anger, and partly from embarrassment at how quickly her reputation was being destroyed. None of that is true. Truth has very little to do with it, child. What matters is what people choose to believe, and people in this town have chosen to believe the worst about both you and Marcus Stone. Mrs. Mills stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the snow-covered street where a few early risers were already making their way to work. I have a choice to make, Elena. I can ask you to leave, protect my business, and let the gossips have their victory. Or I can stand by a good person who's being persecuted for showing basic human decency. Elena waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. I've made my choice, Mrs. Mills said, turning back to face her. You can stay as long as you need to, and anyone who doesn't like it can find somewhere else to conduct their business. The relief that flooded through Elena was so intense it left her feeling weak. She had not realized until that moment how terrified she had been finding herself truly alone in a hostile world. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Mrs. Mills said with a sad smile. "This isn't going to make life easier for either of us. But sometimes doing the right thing is more important than doing the easy thing." That afternoon, Elena made a decision that she knew would only deepen the scandal surrounding her name. She wrapped a loaf of fresh bread in a clean cloth, put on her warmest shawl, and walked deliberately toward the mill. If the town was determined to create a story about her relationship with Marcus Stone, she might as well give them something real to talk about. The mill stood silent as she approached, no sound of hammering echoing from within. For a moment, Elena wondered if Marcus had left town, driven away by the same social pressure that was being applied to her. But as she drew closer, she could see smoke rising from the chimney and the faint glow of the forge through the windows. She knocked on the doorframe, since the wide doors were closed against the cold. "Mr. Stone?" she called. "It's Elena Rivera." The sound of heavy footsteps approached, and then Marcus appeared in the doorway. He looked surprised to see her, his dark eyes searching her face as if looking for signs of fear or reluctance. "Miss Rivera," he said carefully, "I heard there's been talk about your visit here the other day." "Yes," Elena said simply, "there's been much talk." Marcus stepped back as if she had struck him. "Then you shouldn't be here. Whatever damage has been done to your reputation, it will only get worse if people see you here again." Elena held up the wrapped bread. "I brought this to thank you for your kindness the other day." and to apologize for the trouble my visit has caused you." "You don't owe me any apologies," Marcus said, but he made no move to accept the bread. "But you do owe yourself better than to be associated with someone like me." "Someone like you?" Elena repeated. "What exactly are you like, Mr. Stone?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his scarred face unreadable in the gray afternoon light. Finally, he stepped aside and gestured for her to enter the mill. "If you're determined to ruin your reputation," he said, with what might have been humor, "you might as well do it properly." The interior of the mill was warm and well lit, the forge casting dancing shadows on the walls. Elena noticed details she had missed during her brief first visit: the careful organization of tools, the half-finished projects that spoke of artistic skill as well as practical craftsmanship, the small living area in one corner with a simple bed and a table covered with books. "You read," Elena observed, moving toward the table. The books were worn but well cared for, their titles ranging from practical manuals to poetry collections. "When there's time," Marcus said, watching her examine his small library. "Reading helps pass the long evenings." Elena picked up a volume of Shakespeare, running her fingers over the leather binding. The pages fell open to reveal margins filled with careful notes written in a precise hand. "You write also," she said. "Some not much worth reading." Elena looked up at him, this man the town called a beast, who read Shakespeare and wrote thoughtful notes in the margins of books. "They are wrong about you," she said quietly. "Are they?" Marcus asked. "I did survive a fire that killed 3 other men. I did come here to escape the questions and the accusations. Maybe they're not as wrong as you want to believe." "What happened?" Elena asked. "In the fire, I mean." Marcus was silent for so long that Elena thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I was the night watchman at a warehouse in Denver. Good job, steady pay, and I needed both after. After I left the army, the fire started in the middle of the night, probably from a lantern that wasn't properly extinguished." He moved too, the forge staring into the flames as if seeing something else entirely. "There were 4 of us in the building when it started. 3 workers who had stayed late to finish a shipment, and me. The fire spread faster than anyone could have imagined, trapping us on the upper floor." Elena waited, understanding that this was not a story Marcus had told often, if ever. "I found a way out," he continued. "A window that led to a fire escape the others couldn't reach. I called to them, tried to help them find another way, but the smoke was too thick and the heat too intense. I had to choose between staying and dying with them or leaving and living with the guilt." "You chose to live," Elena said. "I chose to save myself," Marcus corrected, his voice harsh with self-recrimination. "And then I had to live with the accusations, the questions about why. I survived when they didn't. People suggested I had inside knowledge about the fire, that I had been paid to start it, that I had deliberately left the other men to die." Elena moved closer to him, seeing the pain etched in every line of his scarred face. "But you know the truth, do I?" Marcus turned to look at her, his eyes dark with years of doubt. "Sometimes I wonder if I could have tried harder, stayed longer, found another way to save them. Sometimes I think maybe the people who called me a coward and a murderer were right." Elena reached out without thinking, covering his hand with hers. His skin was warm and rough with calluses, the fingers stained with metal dust and scarred from years of forge work. "You are not a coward," she said firmly. "A coward would not have tried to help them at all. A coward would not carry such guilt. For so many years." Marcus looked down at their joined hands, his expression unreadable. "You don't know me, Miss Rivera. You don't know what I'm capable of." "I know enough," Elena said. "I know you defended my right to think for myself when others would have dismissed me. I know you work with your hands to create beautiful things. I know you read poetry and live alone rather than subject others to the cruelty of their own assumptions." She paused, gathering courage for what she wanted to say next. And I know that whatever happened in that fire, it has haunted you far more than it has punished you. Marcus pulled his hand away, but gently, without rejecting her touch entirely. Why are you here, Elena? Really here, I mean. You could have thanked me from a distance, avoided the scandal entirely. Elena looked around the mill, at the evidence of Marcus's solitary life, at the books that were his only companions and the work that was his only purpose. She thought about her own isolation, her struggle to find a place in a community that seemed determined to keep her at the margins. Because, she said finally, I understand what it means to be judged by things you cannot control. I understand what it means to be alone in a place where everyone else seems to belong. Marcus studied her face in the firelight. And what do you want from me? The question was direct, almost challenging, as if he expected her to reveal some hidden agenda or selfish motivation. Elena considered her answer carefully, knowing that honesty was the only foundation upon which any kind of relationship could be built. I want nothing from you, she said. But I would like to offer you something. What? Elena hesitated, knowing that what she was about to suggest would seem presumptuous, possibly even insulting. I noticed you have many books, but I also noticed you have no paper for writing letters. No ink, no proper pens. If you would like, I could help you obtain such things. I could. She paused, gathering courage. I could help you write to people if you wish to contact them. Marcus frowned. What makes you think I can't write my own letters? I did not say you could not write, Elena said quickly. I said I could help. There is difference. What kind of help? Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she pressed on. I cannot read or write very well. Only a little Spanish and almost no English words. If you were willing to teach me, I could help you with shopping, with dealing with people in town, with anything that requires speaking to those who might be more comfortable with a woman. The suggestion hung in the air between them like smoke from the forge. Elena knew she was proposing an arrangement that would scandalize the town even further, that would cement her reputation as someone who had abandoned all pretense of proper behavior. But she also knew that Marcus Stone needed human connection as much as she needed education, and perhaps they could help each other find what they were missing. You want me to teach you to read and write, Marcus said slowly. Yes, in exchange for helping me deal with the outside world. Yes. Marcus was quiet for a long time, considering. When he finally spoke, his voice held a note of something Elena had not heard before. Hope, perhaps, or simply the relief of someone who had been offered genuine friendship after years of isolation. It would take time, he said. Learning to read and write properly, I mean, months, maybe longer. I have time. And it would mean coming here regularly, which would only make the gossip worse. Elena lifted her chin with the same stubbornness that had gotten her into this situation in the first place. Let them talk. I have learned that people will create stories whether you give them material or not. At least this way, the story serves a purpose. Marcus almost smiled at that, the expression transforming his scarred face in a way that made Elena's breath catch. When would you like to start? Now, Elena said without hesitation, if you are willing. Marcus moved to the table where his books were kept and selected a primer with simple illustrations and large letters. Very well, he said, settling onto a wooden bench and patting the space beside him. Let's begin with your name. Elena sat down beside him, close enough to see the pages clearly, but not so close as to seem forward. Marcus opened the book to a page filled with the alphabet, each letter carefully illustrated and explained. Can you write any letters? He asked. A few, Elena admitted. But not well, and not in English. Marcus picked up a piece of charcoal from near the forge and handed it to her. Show me what you can do. Elena took the charcoal with hands that trembled slightly, whether from nervousness or excitement, she couldn't say. on a smooth piece of wood that Marcus provided. She carefully scratched out the letters Elena, the movements awkward and uncertain. Marcus studied her work with the same careful attention he had given to the metal he had been shaping earlier. "Good," he said. "Your letters are well formed, just lacking confidence. Here, let me show you how to hold the charcoal for better control." His hand covered hers, guiding her fingers to a more efficient grip. His touch was warm and steady, and Elena found herself acutely aware of his nearness, of the scent of metal and wood smoke that clung to his clothes, of the way his scarred face looked gentle in concentration. "Better," he said as she practiced the grip. "Now let's work on the other letters you'll need." For the next hour, Marcus patiently guided Elena through the basics of English lettering, his voice low and encouraging as she struggled with unfamiliar shapes and sounds. He never showed impatience when she had to repeat a letter multiple times, never made her feel foolish for asking questions that seemed obvious. When Elena finally managed to write her full name in clear, recognizable English letters, the sense of accomplishment was overwhelming. She stared at the wooden board as if it contained magic, as if the simple act of forming those letters had given her access to an entirely new world. "Elena Rivera," Marcus read aloud, and hearing her name, spoken in his deep voice, sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "It looks different in English," she said. "Different how?" Elena considered the question carefully. "In Spanish, my name feels like music. In English, it looks like it belongs somewhere, like it could be part of something larger." Marcus nodded as if he understood exactly what she meant. "Language has power," he said. "The ability to read and write gives you the power to speak for yourself, to leave your mark on the world in a way that lasts." As the afternoon light began to fade, Elena reluctantly prepared to leave. She had been in the mill for several hours, far longer than any respectable woman should spend alone with a man, especially one with Marcus's reputation. But she found herself reluctant to return to the cold reality of Mrs. Mills's boarding house and the hostile stares of Millbrook Valley's residence. "Same time tomorrow?" Marcus asked as he walked her to the door. "Yes," Elena said without hesitation. "And Mr. Stone?" "Thank you, for all of it." Marcus studied her face in the gathering dusk. "Thank you, Elena, for giving me something to look forward to." As Elena walked back through the town, she felt the weight of watching eyes and whispered conversations. By tomorrow, everyone in Millbrook Valley would know that she had spent the afternoon alone with Marcus Stone. Victoria Ashford would undoubtedly have new ammunition for her campaign of social destruction, and Thomas Whitman would find new ways to pressure Mrs. Mills and anyone else who showed Elena kindness. But for the first time since arriving in this harsh, unforgiving place, Elena felt like she was moving towards something positive, something that would make her stronger rather than smaller. She had her name written in English letters, she had a teacher who treated her with respect, and she had taken the first steps toward claiming a kind of power that no one could take away from her. The snow continued to fall as she made her way home, but Elena no longer felt the cold quite so keenly. Tomorrow she would return to the mill, and Marcus Stone would teach her more letters, more words, more ways to make her voice heard in a language that was becoming less foreign with each passing hour. In her small room that night, Elena practiced writing her name over and over on a piece of precious paper, each iteration becoming more confident and clear. She was no longer just the immigrant woman who didn't belong in Millbrook Valley. She was Elena Rivera, and she was learning to write her own story. The rhythm of Elena's days transformed with the quiet precision of seasons changing. Each morning, she completed her duties at the boarding house with methodical efficiency, her mind already reaching toward the afternoon hours she would spend at the mill. The weight of the town's disapproval had settled around her shoulders like a familiar shawl, uncomfortable but no longer surprising. She had learned to navigate the whispered conversations that ceased when she entered rooms, the deliberate turning of backs when she passed down the street, the way shopkeepers served her with cold politeness that barely concealed their judgment. Mrs. Mills had proven to be a stalwart ally, though Elena could see the cost of that loyalty etched in the older woman's increasingly drawn features. 2 families had already moved their relatives to other boarding establishments, citing concerns about the moral atmosphere. The loss of income was significant enough that Mrs. Mills had begun taking in washing from some of the wealthier families, her arthritic hands growing more gnarled from the constant labor in harsh water. Victoria Ashford had orchestrated the campaign against Elena with the strategic precision of a military commander. The attacks never came directly. Victoria was far too sophisticated for crude confrontation. Instead, she wielded influence, like a blade, cutting away Elena's connections to the community with surgical efficiency. The ladies' auxiliary suddenly found themselves too busy to require Elena's sewing services. The minister's wife regretfully informed her that the church no longer needed assistance with Sunday preparations. Even the doctor's family, who had previously employed Elena to clean their offices, discovered they could manage without her help. Each rejection came wrapped in polite excuses and expressions of regret, but Elena understood the underlying message clearly enough. Associate with the beast, and find yourself cast out from respectable society. The choice was presented as simple: abandon Marcus Stone and gradually work her way back into the community's good graces, or persist in her scandalous behavior and face increasing isolation. Elena chose persistence. The decision brought its own form of liberation. Once she stopped trying to win approval from people determined to withhold it, she found herself free to focus on what truly mattered. Her afternoons at the mill became islands of purpose in an ocean of hostility. Hours when she could forget about the weight of watchful eyes and concentrate on the miraculous process of transforming symbols into meaning. Marcus proved to be a teacher of remarkable patience and insight. He understood that learning to read was about more than memorizing letters and sounds. It was about discovering that words held power, that language could be a tool for shaping reality rather than simply enduring it. He began each lesson by asking Elena to write her name, watching her growing confidence as the letters became more fluid, more certain. Writing your name is the first act of claiming ownership over your own story, he told her one gray afternoon as snow pressed against the mill's windows. Every person who can write their name has declared themselves present in the world, worthy of being remembered. Elena practiced the movements until they became as natural as breathing, her hand moving across the precious paper with increasing sureness. But Marcus didn't stop with her name. He introduced her to other words, simple ones at first: bread, water, home, hope, and then gradually more complex concepts that required her to think about meaning as well as spelling. "What does courage look like to you?" he asked one day after she had successfully written the word 3 times without error. Elena considered the question while tracing the letters with her finger. "Courage looks like Mrs. Mills telling Thomas Whitman that I could stay at the boarding house. Courage looks like you teaching me, even though it makes people angry. Courage looks like..." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Like choosing to be kind when the world tells you to be cruel." Marcus smiled at her answer, the expression transforming his scarred features in a way that never failed to make Elena's heart skip. "And what does courage feel like?" "Frightening," Elena said honestly. "Like standing at the edge of a cliff and choosing to jump anyway. Why jump? Because maybe you learn to fly." These conversations became as important as the formal lessons. Marcus would pose questions that made Elena think about words not just as tools for communication, but as ways of understanding herself and the world around her. He encouraged her to express opinions, to argue with ideas she found in the books. They read together, to develop her own voice rather than simply absorbing what others told her. "Many people can read," Marcus told her during one particularly memorable lesson. "Fewer people can think about what they read. Even fewer can write. Down thoughts that matter. Elena was working her way through a simple story about a woman who traveled west to start a new life, her finger following each word as she sounded out the more difficult passages. The parallels to her own experience were not lost on her, though. The woman in the story faced different challenges than social ostracism and whispered scandals. This woman, Elena said, pointing to a passage about the character's determination to build a farm, despite neighbors who believed women couldn't manage land. She reminds me of someone. Who? Elena looked up at Marcus with a slight smile. Me, except she fights dirt and weather, and I fight gossip and small minds. Which is harder? The question made Elena pause. Physical hardships were concrete, measurable. Either the crops grew or they didn't. Either the house stood against the wind or it fell. Social challenges were more insidious, harder to combat, because they lived in perception rather than reality. Small minds, she said finally. Dirt and weather are honest enemies. They don't pretend to be something they're not. Marcus nodded approvingly. That's the kind of insight that comes from thinking about what you read, not just absorbing it. You're beginning to see that stories aren't just entertainment. They're ways of understanding human nature. As Elena's reading improved, Marcus began introducing her to more complex texts. Poetry initially frustrated her with its indirect language and strange rhythms, but gradually she began to appreciate the way poets could capture emotions that ordinary prose couldn't touch. The first poem that truly spoke to her was about a bird that sang despite being caged, its voice growing stronger with each attempt to silence it. Why does the poet write about a bird? Marcus asked after Elena had struggled through the entire piece. Because writing about a person would be too dangerous, Elena said with sudden understanding. But everyone knows the bird is really about people who refuse to be silenced. Exactly. Sometimes the most powerful truths can only be told indirectly. Elena began to understand that literacy was about more than practical skills. It was about joining a conversation that had been going on for centuries, adding her voice to the countless others who had used words to make sense of existence. When she wrote simple sentences about her daily experiences, she was participating in the same fundamental act as the poets and philosophers whose works filled Marcus's small library. The winter deepened around Millbrook Valley, bringing blizzards that sometimes kept Elena away from the mill for days at a time. During these forced separations, she practiced her letters by candlelight in her small room, copying passages from the Bible that Mrs. Mills allowed her to borrow. The familiar stories took on new meaning when Elena could read them for herself rather than simply listening to Sunday sermons. She began to notice which stories the minister chose to emphasize and which he glossed over quickly, understanding for the first time that even religious instruction could be shaped by personal interpretation. One particularly fierce storm kept the entire town housebound for nearly a week. When Elena finally made her way back to the mill, she found Marcus sitting beside a table covered with wooden alphabet blocks he had carved during the long, isolated days. "I thought these might help with your writing practice," he said, gesturing to the blocks. Each one was beautifully crafted, the letters carved with the same precision he brought to his metalwork. Sometimes it helps to be able to move letters around physically when you're learning to spell new words. Elena picked up one of the blocks, running her fingers over the smooth wood. The letter A was carved deep enough to feel its shape, painted with careful black ink that made it stand out clearly. "You made these for me?" "I had the time," Marcus said, but Elena could see the care that had gone into each piece. This wasn't the work of someone simply filling empty hours. It was the creation of someone who wanted to give her every possible tool for success. "Thank you," she said, and the words carried more weight than simple gratitude. These blocks represented hours of labor, thought, and hope. They were a declaration that Marcus believed in her ability to learn, that he considered her education important enough to warrant his time and skill. Elena began arranging the blocks to spell out words they had been working on, delighting in The way she could physically manipulate the letters to create different combinations. The tactile element helped reinforce the visual learning, and soon she was experimenting with words Marcus hadn't yet taught her, using the blocks to test her understanding of spelling patterns. "What does freedom look like?" Marcus asked, watching her work with the blocks. Elena arranged the letters carefully. Freedom. Freedom looks like being able to read any book I choose. Freedom looks like writing letters to my brother in California so he knows I am safe. Freedom looks like... She paused, considering, like not needing anyone else's permission to think my own thoughts. And what does it feel like? Elena smiled, remembering their earlier conversation about courage. Like learning to fly. As winter slowly began its retreat toward spring, Elena's reading abilities advanced from simple stories to more complex texts. Marcus introduced her to newspapers, though the ones that reached Millbrook Valley were often weeks old by the time they arrived. Reading about events in the wider world gave Elena a sense of connection to something larger than the small dramas of their isolated community. She was particularly fascinated by articles about women who were fighting for the right to vote. Their arguments presented in clear, logical language that made their cause seem both reasonable and inevitable. The idea that women might someday have equal political voice seemed revolutionary to Elena, who had grown up in a world where female opinions were generally considered irrelevant to public discourse. "Do you think women should be allowed to vote?" she asked Marcus one afternoon after reading about a suffrage rally in Denver. "I think anyone intelligent enough to read about the issues and form reasoned opinions should be allowed to vote," Marcus replied. "Gender seems like an arbitrary qualification compared to actual understanding." Elena looked up from the newspaper, surprised by his response. "Most men would not agree with you. Most men are threatened by the idea of women having equal power," Marcus said bluntly. "They prefer systems that maintain their advantages, even when those systems are fundamentally unfair." "And you are not threatened?" Marcus considered the question seriously before answering. "I've spent 5 years being judged by appearances rather than character. I've learned that fair treatment requires people to look past surface differences and consider what really matters. If I want to be judged by my actions rather than my scars, then I should judge others by their capabilities rather than their gender." These conversations helped Elena understand that Marcus's isolation from the community had given him a different perspective on social conventions. While other men accepted traditional hierarchies without question, Marcus had been forced to examine the arbitrary nature of social rules when those rules were used to exclude and punish him. "You think differently than other people," Elena observed. "Exile changes how you see the world," Marcus replied. "When you're outside looking in, you notice things that people on the inside take for granted." Elena understood exactly what he meant. Her own position as an outsider had made her acutely aware of the unspoken rules that governed Millbrook Valley society, the subtle ways that power was distributed and maintained. Learning to read had only sharpened this awareness, giving her access to ideas and perspectives that challenged the assumptions she had grown up accepting. One afternoon in early March, when the first hints of warmth were beginning to soften the edges of winter, Elena arrived at the mill to find Marcus working on something that wasn't metalwork. He stood at a table covered with papers, his brow furrowed in concentration as he wrote with careful, deliberate strokes. "What are you writing?" Elena asked, curious about this departure from their usual routine. Marcus looked up, hesitating for a moment before answering. "A letter to my sister in Philadelphia. I haven't contacted her since I left Denver, but lately I've been thinking that maybe it's time to let her know I'm alive and well." Elena moved closer to see the letter, noting the careful formation of Marcus's handwriting. His letters were precise and well-formed, but there was something tentative about the words themselves, as if he was struggling to find the right tone. "May I read what you have written?" she asked. Marcus nodded, stepping aside so Elena could see the page. The letter began formally, almost stiffly, with an apology for his long silence and a brief summary of his current circumstances. Elena. Read through it twice, noting what Marcus had included and what he had left out. You write like you are afraid of her, Elena observed gently. Maybe I am, Marcus admitted. Sarah was always the good child, the one who married well and stayed close to home. I was the one who caused problems, who made choices that disappointed our parents. She probably thinks I'm dead, and maybe that's easier for her than knowing I'm alive but disgraced. Elena studied his face, seeing the pain that lay beneath his carefully controlled expression. What do you want to tell her? Not what you think you should tell her, but what you want her to know. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at the letter as if it might reveal answers he hadn't yet found. I want to tell her that I'm not the same person who left Philadelphia 15 years ago. I want her to know that I've learned things about kindness and resilience that I never understood when we were young. I want to tell her about you, about how teaching someone to read has reminded me that I'm capable of creating something good in the world. Then tell her those things, Elena said simply. She might not want to hear from me, she might not. But you will never know unless you try. And if she chooses not to respond, that is her decision to make. You can only control what you choose to say, not how she chooses to receive it. Marcus picked up his pen again, but instead of continuing with the formal letter he had started, he pushed the paper aside and took out a fresh sheet. Will you help me? He asked. You're better with words than I am, at least when it comes to expressing feelings. Elena felt a warm glow of pride at his request. After months of being the student, Marcus was asking her to be his teacher in matters of emotional honesty. What would you like to say to her? Together, they crafted a letter that was both honest and hopeful. Marcus wrote about his life in Millbrook Valley, about the work that gave him purpose and the reading that filled his quiet evenings. He mentioned Elena, describing her as a friend who had reminded him that human connection was possible, even in unlikely circumstances. He acknowledged the years of silence without dwelling on the reasons for it, and he invited Sarah to write back if she wished to renew their relationship. It's perfect, Elena said after they had finished revising the letter together. It sounds like you, not like someone trying to impress her. Marcus carefully copied the final version onto his best paper, his handwriting more confident now that he was expressing genuine thoughts rather than formal obligations. As he folded the letter and prepared it for mailing, Elena could see something in his expression that hadn't been there before. Hope, perhaps, or simply the quiet satisfaction of someone who had chosen courage over fear. Thank you, he said, sealing the envelope with careful precision. I couldn't have written this without your help. You could have, Elena said. You just needed someone to remind you that honesty is more important than perfection. As they worked together that afternoon, Elena realized that their relationship had evolved into something more complex than simple teacher and student. They had become collaborators, each bringing different strengths to their shared project of learning and growth. Marcus had given her the tools to read and write, but she had given him something equally valuable, the reminder that he was worthy of connection, that his thoughts and feelings mattered enough to be shared with others. The letter to Sarah represented a turning point for both of them. Marcus was reaching out beyond the safe boundaries of his exile, taking the risk of rejection in hopes of reclaiming part of his past. Elena, in helping him craft the letter, had discovered that she could use her growing literacy skills to help others express their deepest truths. As the afternoon light began to fade and Elena prepared to return to town, she felt a sense of anticipation that had nothing to do with their usual lessons. Something was changing in Millbrook Valley, something that went beyond her own personal growth or Marcus's tentative reconnection with his family. Spring was coming, and with it would come new challenges and new opportunities. Same time tomorrow? Marcus asked as he walked her to the door. Always, Elena replied, and she meant it. No matter what storms lay ahead, she would continue coming. To the mill, continue learning, continue growing into the person she was meant to become. The town's disapproval had lost its power to frighten her. She had found something more valuable than social acceptance. She had found purpose, partnership, and the unshakable knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged. Spring arrived in Millbrook Valley with the suddenness of a revelation, transforming the landscape from stark winter whites to the tender greens of new growth. The snow that had blanketed the town for months melted into rushing streams that carried the winter's accumulated sorrows toward distant rivers. Elena noticed the change not just in the world around her, but in herself. The woman who walked to the mill each afternoon bore little resemblance to the frightened immigrant who had first offended Marcus Stone against Victoria Ashford's cruel assumptions. The letter to Marcus's sister had been mailed 3 weeks earlier, and though no response had yet arrived, the act of sending it had changed something fundamental in Marcus's demeanor. He moved with less of the careful withdrawal that had characterized his interactions with the world, and Elena often caught him glancing toward the road as if expecting something good to arrive rather than something threatening. Elena's own transformation was more dramatic. She could now read entire newspaper articles without assistance. Her finger no longer needed to trace each word, and her handwriting had developed a confident flow that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. More importantly, she had begun to write her own thoughts, filling a small journal Marcus had crafted for her with observations about the changing seasons, memories of her homeland, and reflections on the strange journey that had brought her to this unlikely friendship. The town's attitude toward their relationship had shifted from scandalized fascination to grudging resignation. Elena's consistent dignity in the face of social pressure had gradually worn down some of the more vicious gossip, though Victoria Ashford continued her campaign of subtle persecution with unwavering determination. The difference was that Elena no longer felt the sharp sting of exclusion as acutely. She had found something more valuable than social acceptance in the mill, and that discovery had immunized her against the worst effects of communal disapproval. On a morning when the April air carried the promise of genuine warmth, Elena arrived at the mill to find Marcus standing in the doorway, holding an envelope that bore the distinctive handwriting of formal correspondence. His hands trembled slightly as he held the letter, and Elena understood immediately that this was the response from his sister Sarah. "It came on yesterday's mail delivery," Marcus said, his voice carefully controlled. "I haven't opened it yet." Elena studied his face, seeing the complex mixture of hope and fear that struggled for dominance in his expression. After years of silence, any response from his sister would be significant, whether it brought reconciliation or final rejection. "Would you like me to read it with you?" Elena offered gently. Marcus nodded, leading her into the mill where they had shared so many hours of learning and conversation. He sat heavily on the bench they had come to think of as theirs, the envelope resting on his knees like something that might explode if handled carelessly. "What if she tells me never to contact her again?" Marcus asked. "Then you will know where you stand, and you can stop wondering," Elena replied. "But what if she tells you something wonderful?" Marcus managed a weak smile at her optimism. With careful deliberation, he opened the envelope and unfolded 2 sheets of paper covered with neat, feminine handwriting. Elena watched his face as he read, noting the progression of emotions that crossed his scarred features like weather patterns moving across a vast sky. Marcus began, then stopped, clearing his throat before continuing. "She says she never believed the stories about the fire. She says she knew I would never hurt anyone deliberately, and she's been hoping I would contact her for years." Elena felt her own eyes fill with tears at the relief in Marcus's voice. "What else does she say?" Marcus continued reading, his voice growing stronger with each paragraph. "She's married now to a man named David who runs a bookstore. They have 2 children, a boy and a girl. She says David has read about the fire in the newspapers and agrees that the accusations against me were probably fabricated by people looking for someone to blame. She believes in you, Elena said softly. She invites me to visit, Marcus continued, wonder creeping into his voice. She says Philadelphia will always be my home if I want to return, and that her children should know. Their uncle. Elena reached out and covered Marcus's hand with hers, feeling the tremor of emotion that ran through his powerful frame. This letter represented more than family reconciliation. It was validation that he was worthy of love and acceptance, that the years of exile had been imposed by circumstances rather than character. Will you go? Elena asked, though the question made her heart clench with an emotion she wasn't ready to examine too closely. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at the letter as if it might contain additional revelations. I don't. No, he said finally. This place has been my home for 5 years. My work is here, my life is here, you are here. The last words hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither had previously dared to voice. Elena felt her breath catch as she realized that Marcus was considering her presence as a factor in his decision about returning to Philadelphia. Marcus, she began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. I know it's presumptuous, Marcus said quickly. I know you have your own life to consider, your own choices to make. But these months of teaching you, of learning from you, they've been the best of my life. I can't imagine going back to the loneliness I lived with before you started coming. To the mill. Elena looked around the mill that had become so familiar, at the tools and books and carefully organized workspace that reflected Marcus's solitary but purposeful existence. She thought about the woman she had been when she first entered this building, and the woman she had become through their shared hours of learning and discovery. I have been thinking, she said slowly, about what I want my life to become now. That I can read and write. I have been thinking about what it means to have choices. Marcus waited, his dark eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her feel as if her next words might shape both their futures. I want to teach other people what you have taught me, Elena continued. There are women in this town, immigrant women and poor women, who cannot read or write. They clean houses and take in washing and raise children, but they cannot write their own names or read letters from family far away. I want to help them find the same freedom I have found. That's a wonderful ambition, Marcus said. But you could do that anywhere. You could do it in Philadelphia, where people might be more accepting of unconventional ideas. Elena smiled at his careful suggestion. Are you asking me to come with you to Philadelphia? Marcus flushed, the color visible even through his scars. I'm asking if you think there might be a future for us together, wherever that might be. I'm asking if what we've built here means as much to you as it does to me. Elena felt her heart race as she considered the magnitude of what Marcus was suggesting. He wasn't just asking her to accompany him to Philadelphia, he was asking her to build a life with him, to transform their friendship into something deeper and more permanent. Before I answer, Elena said carefully, I need to tell you something. I need you to understand what I have learned about myself during these months of learning to read and write. Marcus nodded, encouraging her to continue. I have learned that I am stronger than I knew. I have learned that I do not need other people's approval to have value. I have learned that love, real love, is not about rescuing someone or being rescued. It is about two people choosing to grow together, to make each other stronger rather than smaller. Elena paused, gathering her courage for what she wanted to say next. I love you, Marcus Stone, not because you taught me to read, not because you were kind when others were cruel, but because you see me as I truly am and help me become who I want to be. If you want to go to Philadelphia, I will go with you. If you want to stay in Millbrook Valley, I will stay with you. But I want to do it as your equal partner, not as someone who needs to be taken care of. Marcus stared at her for a long moment. his expression cycling through surprise, joy, and something that looked like reverence. Then he reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the lines of her cheekbones with infinite gentleness. "Elena Rivera," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you are the bravest, most extraordinary woman I have ever known. I would be honored to build a life with you, wherever that life might take us." When Marcus kissed her, Elena felt as if the last piece of a complex puzzle had finally clicked into place. This was what she had been searching for without knowing. It not just romantic love, but partnership based on mutual respect and shared purpose. They were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching the mill, and Elena reluctantly pulled away from Marcus's embrace. Through the open doorway, she could see Samuel Harper approaching, his kind face creased with what appeared to be concern. "Marcus, Elena," Samuel called as he drew closer. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important, but I have news that I thought you should hear." Elena and Marcus exchanged glances, both wondering what could bring the gentle shopkeeper to the mill with such obvious urgency. "What's happened, Samuel?" Marcus asked. "Victoria Ashford and Thomas Whitman announced their engagement yesterday," Samuel said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been relief. "They're planning to marry in June and move to Denver, where Thomas has been offered a position with his uncle's cattle operation." Elena felt a complex mixture of emotions at this news. Victoria's departure would certainly make life in Millbrook Valley more peaceful, but Elena also recognized that her conflict with Victoria had served an important purpose. It had forced her to choose between conformity and authenticity, and that choice had led her to discover her own strength. "There's more," Samuel continued. The engagement announcement mentioned that Victoria would be selling her family's property here before the move. The word around town is that she's also planning to take several of her closest associates with her to Denver, including some of the women who have been most active in the social campaigns against certain residents. Samuel's careful phrasing made it clear that he was referring to the organized effort to isolate Elena and Marcus from the community. Elena understood that Victoria's departure might signal the end of the most virulent opposition to their relationship. "Why are you telling us this?" Marcus asked. Samuel smiled, his weathered face creasing with genuine warmth. "Because I thought you might like to know that the landscape is changing. Some of us have been watching how you two have conducted yourselves during these difficult months, and we've been impressed by your dignity and determination. When Victoria leaves, I think you'll find the town a more welcoming place." Elena felt a surge of gratitude toward Samuel, who had shown them kindness when kindness was scarce. But she also realized that external validation, while pleasant, was no longer necessary for her happiness. She had learned to value herself independent of community approval. "Thank you for telling us," Elena said. "But Samuel, I want you to know that Marcus and I are considering leaving Millbrook Valley ourselves. We're thinking about starting fresh somewhere new." Samuel's face fell slightly, but he nodded with understanding. "I can't say I blame you. This town hasn't given you much reason to stay. But if you do decide to leave, know that you'll be missed by those of us who recognize quality when we see it." After Samuel departed, Elena and Marcus spent the rest of the afternoon discussing their future with the careful attention they had once devoted to parsing difficult passages in books. Marcus read portions of Sarah's letter aloud, sharing details about Philadelphia and the opportunities that might await them there. Elena described her vision of teaching literacy to women who had been denied educational opportunities, and Marcus offered ideas about how such a program might be established and funded. "We could open a school," Marcus suggested. "Sarah mentions that David's bookstore has a large back room that isn't being used. We could teach reading and writing in the evenings after people finish their work for the day." "Would your sister and her husband accept such an arrangement?" Elena asked. "I think they would," Marcus said, rereading relevant portions of the letter. Sarah writes about her involvement with women's organizations in Philadelphia. She mentions that many of these groups are concerned with education and social reform. Our school might fit perfectly with their existing interests. Elena felt excitement building as they discussed the practical details of their imagined future. The prospect of leaving Millbrook Valley no longer felt like escape, it felt like expansion, an opportunity to apply everything they had learned about teaching and learning to a broader community. "When would we leave?" Elena asked. "After the spring planting is finished," Marcus said. "I have commitments to several families for farm equipment that needs to be completed before the growing season begins. It wouldn't be right to leave them without the tools they need." Elena nodded, appreciating Marcus's sense of responsibility, even toward a community that had treated him harshly. This consideration for others, even when others had shown him little consideration, was one of the qualities that had convinced her of his fundamental goodness. "That gives us 2 months to prepare," Elena said. "Time to save money, time to plan. Our school, time to make sure we're making the right decision. Time to get married," Marcus added quietly. Elena looked up at him in surprise. "Are you proposing to me, Marcus Stone?" Marcus slid off the bench and knelt beside her, taking her hands in his calloused grip. "Elena Rivera, will you marry me? Will you be my partner in all things, my equal in all decisions, my companion for whatever adventures await us?" Elena felt tears of joy spill down her cheeks as she nodded her acceptance. "Yes, Marcus, yes to all of it." The wedding took place 6 weeks later in Mrs. Mills's parlor, with Samuel Harper serving as witness and the local minister performing the ceremony with genuine warmth. Elena wore a simple blue dress that she had sewn herself, and Marcus had commissioned a wedding ring from the town's silversmith, a simple band, engraved with both their initials and the date they had first met. Victoria Ashford had indeed departed for Denver 2 weeks before the wedding, taking with her the core group of women who had made Elena's life difficult. The town's atmosphere had shifted noticeably in her absence, becoming more tolerant and inclusive. Several people who had previously avoided Elena made a point of congratulating her on her engagement, and the minister's wife asked if Elena might be willing to help teach Sunday school children who were struggling with their reading. Elena accepted the teaching position, seeing it as preparation for the larger educational work she planned to undertake in Philadelphia. Working with the children reminded her of her own struggles with literacy and reinforced her conviction that everyone deserved access to the power that reading and writing provided. The night before their departure from Millbrook Valley, Elena and Marcus stood together in the mill that had been the site of so many important moments in their relationship. They had sold most of Marcus's heavy equipment to another blacksmith, but they were taking his books and Elena's journals, the physical record of their shared journey toward understanding. "Do you have any regrets?" Marcus asked as they looked around the space that had sheltered their growing love. Elena considered the question seriously. The past year had been difficult in ways she couldn't have imagined when she first stepped off the train in Millbrook Valley. She had faced social ostracism, economic hardship, and constant pressure to abandon her principles for the sake of acceptance. But she had also discovered strengths she didn't know she possessed, found love that was based on genuine compatibility rather than convenience, and gained skills that would allow her to help others find their own voices. "No regrets," Elena said firmly. "Everything that happened, even the difficult parts, led us to where we are now. And where we are now is exactly where I want to be." Marcus smiled and pulled her close, and Elena felt the same sense of rightness that had characterized all their important moments together. Tomorrow they would board the train for Philadelphia, beginning a new chapter of their lives in a city where Elena's accent wouldn't mark her as foreign, and Marcus's scars wouldn't define him as dangerous. But tonight, they stood together in the mill where Elena had learned to write her own name, where Marcus had rediscovered his capacity for hope, where two wounded souls had found each other and created something beautiful from their shared determination to grow. The morning of their departure dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp air that made everything seem possible. Mrs. Mills had insisted on preparing a farewell breakfast, and she pressed a packet of sandwiches into Elena's hands for the train journey. Samuel Harper arrived early to help them carry their belongings to the station, and several other townspeople gathered to see them off. As the train pulled into the station, Elena thought about the woman who had arrived on this same platform. Less than a year earlier, that woman had been looking for safety and security, hoping to find a place where she could belong without having to change who she was. Instead, she had found something much more valuable: the courage to become who she was meant to be. Marcus squeezed her hand as they boarded the train, and Elena squeezed back, a gesture that had become their private signal of mutual support and shared purpose. Through the window, she could see the mill growing smaller in the distance, and beyond it the mountains that had witnessed their transformation from strangers to partners. "Ready for the next chapter?" Marcus asked as the train gathered speed. Elena smiled and opened the journal she had been keeping throughout their courtship, turning to a fresh page. At the top, in the confident handwriting that Marcus had helped her develop, she wrote, "Philadelphia, a new beginning." Below that, she began to write their story, the real story of the beast who had taught her to write her own name, and the woman who had taught him that love was always possible for those brave enough to reach for it. The train carried them toward a future filled with possibility, toward a city where they would establish their school for women who had been denied education, toward a life built on the foundation of mutual respect and shared dreams. Behind them, Millbrook Valley continued its quiet existence, forever changed by their presence and forever part of their story. Elena wrote steadily as the landscape rolled past the train windows, documenting not just the events of their journey, but the emotions and revelations that had transformed them both. This was the power of literacy that Marcus had given her, not just the ability to read what others had written, but the capacity to write her own truth, to leave her mark on the world in words that would outlast the temporary judgments of small minds. As the afternoon sun slanted through the train windows, Elena looked up from her writing to find Marcus reading one of his beloved books of poetry. He glanced up when he felt her gaze and smiled, the expression transforming his scarred face with the warmth that had first made her understand that appearances could lie. "What are you writing?" he asked. "Our story," Elena replied. "The true story, the one where the beast was never a beast at all, and the woman learned that the greatest freedom comes from refusing to let others define your worth." Marcus reached over and took her free hand, intertwining their fingers with the easy familiarity of true partnership. "And how does our story end?" Elena smiled and returned to her writing. "It doesn't end," she wrote in careful, confident letters. "It begins again, every day, with two people choosing to love each other, and to use that love to make the world a little brighter for everyone they meet." The train rolled on toward Philadelphia, carrying Marcus and Elena toward their new life. Together, behind them, the sun set over Millbrook Valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise that even the most unlikely stories could have the most beautiful endings. The train to Philadelphia moved through the countryside with a steady rhythm that seemed to match the beating of Elena's heart as she watched the familiar landscape of Colorado territory give way to plains that stretched endlessly toward an uncertain horizon. She sat beside Marcus in the passenger car, her hand resting on the leather satchel that contained their most precious possessions, the books that had been her teachers, the journals filled with her growing confidence in written words, and the carefully folded letter from Sarah that had opened the door to their new life. 3 months had passed since their wedding in Mrs. Mills's parlor, 3 months of preparation and planning that had transformed their impulsive dream of leaving Millbrook Valley into a carefully constructed reality. Marcus had completed his final commissions with meticulous attention to detail. ensuring that every farmer in the valley had the tools necessary for a successful harvest. Elena had worked with the minister's wife to establish a continuing program for children who struggled with reading, training 2 of the town's more educated women to carry on the work in her absence. The departure had been more emotional than Elena had anticipated. Mrs. Mills had wept openly as she embraced Elena on the platform, pressing a small wrapped package into her hands with instructions not to open it until they reached Philadelphia. Samuel Harper had shaken Marcus's hand with genuine warmth, telling him that Millbrook Valley's loss was Philadelphia's gain. Even some of the people who had once crossed the street to avoid them came to wish them well, their gestures of farewell carrying the unspoken acknowledgement that time and circumstance had revealed the true character of those they had misjudged. Elena opened her journal as the train swayed gently along the tracks, turning to a fresh page where she intended to document this journey toward their new beginning. But instead of writing about the landscape passing outside the window, she found herself reflecting on the transformation that had brought them to this moment. The woman who had first entered Marcus's mill could barely write her own name in any language. Now she was fluent in English, comfortable with complex texts, and confident enough in her abilities to contemplate teaching others. "What are you thinking about?" Marcus asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "About how much everything has changed," Elena replied, setting down her pen to look at him fully. "About how the person I was when I first offended you against Victoria's cruelty feels like someone I knew long ago rather than someone I used to be." Marcus smiled, the expression that had once been so rare now coming easily to his scarred features. "You were always brave, Elena. You just needed to discover what you were brave enough to do. And you were always kind. You just needed someone to recognize it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the landscape evolve from familiar territory into genuinely foreign terrain. Elena had never traveled so far from home, and the excitement of new experiences mingled with the natural anxiety of leaving everything familiar behind. But Marcus's steady presence beside her served as an anchor, reminding her that home was not a place but a connection between people who had chosen to build something together. As the afternoon progressed, other passengers began conversations that drew Elena and Marcus into the social fabric of the train car. A young minister traveling to his first assignment in Pennsylvania asked Marcus about his trade, leading to a discussion of craftsmanship that revealed Marcus's deep knowledge of metalworking techniques. An elderly woman traveling to visit her daughter admired Elena's needlework, which led to an exchange of practical advice about domestic skills that left Elena feeling genuinely included in the community of travelers. Elena noticed how different these interactions felt from the careful social negotiations she had grown accustomed to in Millbrook Valley. Here, among strangers who had no preconceptions about her background or Marcus's reputation, they were simply a young married couple traveling toward a new opportunity. The freedom to present themselves without the weight of history was intoxicating, offering a glimpse of what their life in Philadelphia might become. "Tell me more about your sister," Elena said as the sun began to sink toward the western horizon. "I want to understand what kind of woman would maintain faith in her brother despite years of separation and ugly rumors." Marcus considered the question carefully, his expression growing thoughtful as he recalled memories that had been locked away for years. Sarah was always the one who saw possibilities where others saw problems. "When we were children, I was the troublemaker, the one who asked too many questions and challenged authority without considering consequences. Sarah had a gift for understanding why people acted the way they did, even when their behavior seemed incomprehensible to everyone else." He paused, watching the landscape roll past the window as if the movement might help him organize his thoughts. She never accepted simple explanations for complex situations. When our parents tried to tell her that some people were just naturally bad or good, she would ask questions that made them uncomfortable. Why was the town drunk cruel when he was sober but kind when he was drinking? Why did the richest family in town never give to charity, while the poorest family always shared what little they had? Elena felt a spark of recognition at this description. She sounds like someone who would understand that reputation and character are not the same thing. Exactly. I think that's why her letter didn't surprise me as much as it might have. Sarah never accepted other people's judgments without examining the evidence for herself. And her husband, David? I never met him, but Sarah's letters paint a picture of a man who shares her intellectual curiosity and social conscience. The fact that he runs a bookstore and involves himself in community education suggests someone who believes in the power of knowledge to improve lives. Elena nodded, feeling increasingly optimistic about their reception in Philadelphia. The prospect of working with people who shared their values and understood the transformative potential of literacy was exciting in a way that their isolated efforts in Millbrook Valley had never been. As evening approached, the conductor announced that they would reach Philadelphia the following morning. Elena felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness as she realized how close they were to the moment when their carefully constructed plans would meet the reality of a new city and unknown challenges. "Are you worried about anything?" Marcus asked, apparently sensing her mood. Elena considered the question honestly. "I'm worried that I might not be ready for city life." Millbrook Valley was small enough that I could understand how everything worked, who had influence, what the unspoken rules were. Philadelphia will be so much larger and more complex. But you'll also have more opportunities, Marcus pointed out. In a small town, there are only a few ways to make a living and only a few people who control most of the resources. In a city, there are dozens of different communities, hundreds of different opportunities. If one group doesn't appreciate what you have to offer, you can find another group that does. Elena smiled at his optimism, but she also recognized the wisdom in his perspective. The diversity that made cities overwhelming could also make them more accepting of people who didn't fit conventional expectations. "What about you?" Elena asked. "Are you worried about returning to a place that knew you before the fire, before the accusations?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped loosely in his lap as he considered her question. "I'm worried that I might not be ready to be the person Sarah remembers." 5 years of exile changes a man, Elena. I'm not the same person who left Philadelphia, and I'm not sure I want to be. What kind of person are you now? I'm someone who has learned the value of solitude without becoming bitter about loneliness. I'm someone who has discovered that being judged unfairly teaches you to judge others more fairly. I'm someone who understands that real strength comes from helping others find their own power rather than from dominating them. Elena reached over and took his hand, feeling the familiar comfort of his calloused palm against hers. "Those sound like improvements to me. I hope Sarah sees it that way." They spent the evening reading together, a practice that had become as natural as breathing during their months of shared learning. Marcus worked through a collection of essays about social reform, while Elena practiced her writing by composing letters to Mrs. Mills and Samuel Harper, describing their journey and expressing gratitude for the kindness they had received. The act of writing to friends left behind helped ease the melancholy of departure while reinforcing her growing confidence in her ability to maintain relationships across distance and time. When the train finally pulled into Philadelphia's Union Station the next morning, Elena felt as if she was stepping into a different world entirely. The noise and bustle of the great terminal overwhelmed her senses, with hundreds of people moving in what appeared to be random directions, but somehow managing to avoid colliding with each other. The sound of announcements echoed off the high ceiling, mixing with the conversations of travelers and the mechanical noise of trains arriving and departing. Marcus seemed equally overwhelmed by the sensory assault, his hand tightening around Elena's as they gathered their belongings and prepared to disembark. Elena realized that his years in Millbrook Valley had accustomed him to small-town quiet, just as much as they had accustomed her to manageable social interactions. "Sarah said she would meet us by the information booth," Marcus said, scanning the crowd for a familiar face among the sea of strangers. Elena studied the passing people, trying to imagine which woman might be Marcus's sister. She had formed a mental picture based on his descriptions, but the reality of seeing Sarah for the first time would undoubtedly be different from any expectation. Marcus Stone? Elena turned toward the voice and saw a woman approaching them with quick, confident steps. Sarah was shorter than Elena had imagined, with dark hair streaked with premature gray and intelligent eyes that were unmistakably related to Marcus's. She wore a practical traveling dress and carried herself with the kind of assurance that came from someone accustomed to managing complex situations. "Sarah," Marcus said, and Elena could hear years of suppressed emotion in that single word. The siblings embraced with the careful intensity of people who had thought they might never see each other again. Elena watched their reunion with tears in her eyes, understanding that this moment represented more than a simple family gathering. It was Marcus's reintegration into a world that had once rejected him, his reclamation of an identity that went beyond the labels others had imposed on him. "And you must be Elena," Sarah said, turning to her with genuine warmth. "Marcus wrote about you in his letter, but he didn't mention how lovely you are." Elena felt herself flush with pleasure at the compliment, but more importantly, she felt accepted in a way that had become rare during their final months in Millbrook Valley. Sarah's greeting carried none of the careful distance that characterized social interactions with people who disapproved of her choices. "Thank you for welcoming me," Elena said. "Marcus has told me so much about you that I feel as if we're already friends." "I hope we will be," Sarah replied with a smile that transformed her serious features. "David is waiting outside with the carriage. He's very excited to meet you both and to hear about your plans for the literacy school." As they made their way through the crowded terminal, Sarah kept up a steady stream of conversation that gradually put Elena at ease. She asked about their journey, expressed interest in Elena's background, and shared details about Philadelphia that helped orient them to their new home. Her manner was warm without being overwhelming, curious without being intrusive. David proved to be as welcoming as his wife, a tall, thin man with prematurely gray hair and the kind of intense gaze that Elena associated with people who spent their lives surrounded by books. His bookstore occupied the ground floor of a substantial building in a neighborhood that buzzed with intellectual energy, and Elena could immediately see why Marcus had thought it would be a good location for their school. "Sarah has told me about your teaching experience in Colorado," David said as they toured the store. "The back room would be perfect for evening classes, and we already have connections with several women's organizations that would be interested in supporting literacy education." Elena examined the space with growing excitement. The room was large enough to accommodate 20 students comfortably, with good light from tall windows and enough wall space for the kind of visual aids that would help beginning readers. She could envision the benches and writing tables that Marcus could build, the alphabet charts and simple books that would serve as teaching materials. "What kind of women would we be teaching?" Elena asked. "Immigrants mostly," Sarah replied. "Women who work in the textile factories and garment shops, but never had the opportunity to learn English reading and writing. Many of them are supporting families and can only attend classes in the evenings after their work is finished." Elena nodded, remembering her own struggles with English literacy and the way that learning to read had opened doors she hadn't even known existed. The prospect of helping other women discover that same empowerment filled her with a sense of purpose that went beyond simple employment. "There's also the matter of funding," David continued. "Several of the reform organizations have indicated they would be willing to provide financial support for a program like this, especially if it's run by people with actual experience rather than well-meaning but inexperienced volunteers." Marcus and Elena exchanged glances, both recognizing the significance of this offer. Financial support would mean they could focus on teaching rather than worrying about basic survival, and institutional backing would provide legitimacy that might be difficult to achieve on their own. Over the following days, Elena and Marcus settled into the rhythm of city life with surprising ease. They found lodging in a boarding house near David's bookstore, a comfortable establishment run by a widow who rented rooms to working people rather than transients. Their fellow boarders included a young doctor, a clerk who worked for a shipping company, and 2 women who taught at local schools, creating a social environment that felt both stimulating and welcoming. Elena began planning the curriculum for their literacy school with the same methodical approach Marcus had used to teach her. She remembered which techniques had been most effective for her own learning and consulted with Sarah about the specific needs of immigrant women who would be balancing education with demanding work schedules and family responsibilities. The key is to make every lesson immediately useful, Elena explained to Sarah as they discussed teaching strategies. If a woman can see how reading will help her understand her children's school assignments or write letters to family members, she finds time for lessons no matter how tired she is. Marcus divided his time between exploring opportunities for metalworking employment and preparing the physical space for their school. He designed and built tables that could be easily moved and stored, created alphabet cards that were large enough to be seen from across the room, and constructed a collection of simple writing implements that would be durable enough for repeated use. Elena was particularly pleased with the small library they assembled for beginning readers. David contributed books from his store, Sarah solicited donations from her women's organizations, and Elena selected materials based on her own experience. Of which stories and topics had captured her interest when she was struggling with literacy? The first session of the Elena Rivera School for Women's Literacy took place on a crisp October evening, 6 weeks after their arrival in Philadelphia. Elena had expected perhaps a dozen students based on initial inquiries, but 23 women crowded into the back room of David's bookstore, their faces reflecting a mixture of hope and skepticism that Elena remembered feeling herself. She stood before them with Marcus beside her, looking out at faces that represented a dozen different countries and languages. Some of the women were young, barely out of their teens, while others were grandmothers whose children had grown and left home. What united them was the hunger Elena saw in their eyes, the same desperate desire for knowledge and empowerment that had driven her to seek education despite social pressure and personal fear. "My name is Elena Rivera Stone," she began writing, her name on the large slate Marcus had mounted on the wall. 2 years ago, I could not write those words. I could not read a letter from my family or help my children with their schoolwork. I could not speak for myself when others tried to tell my story for me. She paused, seeing recognition in several faces as women realized they were looking at someone who had faced the same challenges that brought them to this room. Tonight, we begin changing that together. By the end of this class, every one of you will be able to write your own name in English letters. By the end of this program, you will be able to read letters from your families, help your children with their studies, and speak for yourselves in the language of your new country. Elena moved to the slate and wrote the alphabet in large, clear letters. We start with these 26 symbols, but we end with the power to tell our own stories. Who would like to learn to write her name first? Every hand in the room went up, and Elena felt the same surge of purpose and joy that had characterized her best moments learning with Marcus. This was what literacy was meant to accomplish, not just individual advancement, but community empowerment, the creation of opportunities for people to claim their own voices and determine their own futures. The evening session lasted 2 hours, and by the end, every woman in the room had successfully written her name at least once. Elena watched with satisfaction as they filed out, many clutching the papers bearing their names as if they were precious documents. Several women approached her with questions about the next session, And Elena could see that word of the school would spread quickly through the immigrant communities of Philadelphia. "How did it feel?" Marcus asked as they cleaned the room after the last student had departed. Elena considered the question while she gathered the writing materials they had distributed for practice. "It felt like the most important thing I've ever done," she said finally. "When I saw their faces light up as they wrote their names, I remembered exactly how that moment felt for me. I remembered understanding for the first time that I could leave my mark on the world in a way that would last." Marcus smiled and moved to help her organize the teaching materials for storage. Sarah was watching from the doorway for a few minutes during the lesson. She said she had never seen anything quite like it, the way you connected with those women. "Because I understand them in a way that people who have always been able to read and write cannot," Elena replied. "I know what it feels like to be invisible in your own life, to have other people speak for you because you cannot speak for yourself." Over the following months, the school grew beyond their most optimistic projections. Word spread through the immigrant communities, and soon they had a waiting list of women eager to join the program. Elena found herself teaching 3 evenings a week, with Marcus assisting by providing individual help to students who needed extra attention. More importantly, Elena began to see the transformative effects of literacy education rippling outward into the community. Women who had completed the program started teaching their children and neighbors. Families who had been dependent on others to read important documents began handling their own affairs. Several graduates found better employment because they could now read instructions and fill out forms independently. Elena also discovered that teaching had improved her own skills dramatically. The process of explaining concepts to others forced her to understand them more deeply, and the questions her students asked often led her to insights she hadn't achieved during her own learning process. "I want to expand the program," Elena told Marcus one evening as they walked home from a particularly successful class session. "I want to offer advanced classes for women who have mastered basic literacy but want to improve their writing skills. I want to start a lending library so graduates can continue reading after they finish the program. I want to train some of our best students to become teachers themselves so we can reach even more people." Marcus listened to her ambitious plans with the same encouraging attention he had given to her first tentative attempts to read simple sentences. "All of those sound like wonderful ideas," he said. "But they would require more space, more funding, more organizational support." Elena nodded, acknowledging the practical challenges while refusing to be discouraged by them. Sarah has been talking to her reform organization friends about establishing a permanent institution for immigrant education. David thinks the city might be willing to provide financial support if we can demonstrate the program's effectiveness. "And what do you think?" Elena smiled, feeling the same confidence that had carried her through her confrontations with Victoria Ashford and her decision to leave everything familiar behind for an uncertain future. "I think we're going to build something important here, Marcus. Something that will outlast us and help more people than we can even imagine right now." As winter settled over Philadelphia, Elena found herself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had first entered Marcus's mill in search of simple human kindness had become someone who could envision and implement programs that would change hundreds of lives. The man who had been branded a beast by a frightened community had become her partner in creating something beautiful and lasting. Their personal relationship had deepened alongside their professional collaboration. They had learned to work together with the kind of seamless cooperation that came from mutual respect and shared purpose. Their evening conversations ranged from practical discussions about teaching techniques to philosophical explorations of education's role in social change. "Do you ever miss Millbrook Valley?" Marcus asked one snowy evening as they sat by the fire in their boarding house room, reading and writing in comfortable companionship. Elena considered the question while she finished writing a letter to Mrs. Mills, sharing news of their success and expressing continued gratitude for the older woman's support during their most difficult period. "I miss the simplicity sometimes," Elena said finally. "I miss being able to walk outside and see mountains and endless sky. I miss knowing everyone in town, even the people who didn't like us. But you don't regret leaving?" "Never," Elena said firmly. "What we've built here, what we're building, it's so much larger than anything we could have accomplished in Millbrook Valley. Here, we're not fighting against prejudice and small-mindedness. We're working with people who share our values and want to help us succeed." Marcus nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "Sometimes I think about the person I was when I first came to Millbrook Valley, so focused on hiding from the world that I forgot I had anything to offer it. Teaching you reminded me that I could still create something good, but teaching here has shown me that good things can grow beyond anything I initially imagined." Elena set aside her letter and moved to sit beside Marcus on the small sofa they had positioned near the window. Outside, snow continued to fall on the bustling streets of Philadelphia, but inside their room warmth and purpose created a sense of home that had nothing to do with geography. "What do you want our life to look like in 5 years?" Elena asked, a question that had become a favorite topic of their evening conversations. Marcus smiled and pulled her closer, his arms settling around her shoulders with familiar comfort. "I want the Elena Rivera Stone School for Women's Literacy to be the most respected educational institution in Philadelphia. I want graduates of our program to be teaching in schools throughout the city. I want other cities to send representatives here to learn how to establish similar programs. And personally, I want to watch you become the woman you're meant to be, and I want to be worthy of the partnership you've given me." Elena felt tears of happiness gather in her eyes as she considered how far they had both traveled from the broken people who had first found each other in a mill at the edge of nowhere. "I love you, Marcus Stone," she said, the words carrying all the weight of gratitude and hope and determination that had sustained them through every challenge. "I love you too, Elena Rivera Stone," Marcus replied, and in his voice she heard the same promise that had been present since the day he first offered to teach her to write her name, the promise that they would face whatever came next as partners, equals, and the creators of their own extraordinary story. Outside their window, Philadelphia continued its busy existence, a city full of people seeking opportunities and second chances and the freedom to become whoever they chose to be. Somewhere in that vast urban landscape, women who had attended Elena's literacy classes were reading bedtime stories to their children in clear, confident voices. Others were writing letters to family members in distant countries, their words carrying love across oceans and continents. Elena had learned to write her own name in that mill in Millbrook Valley, but here in Philadelphia, she was writing something much more significant, a new chapter in the long story of human possibility, one carefully chosen word at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.